Hello, and welcome to the Bookcast Club, a podcast for people who love books. In the last episode, Jenny and I were talking to you about books coming out in the future. And now we're going to be talking to you about things in the past, because I am joined by Russell from the YouTube channel Ink and Paper. Is it Ink and Paper blog, or is it just Ink and Paper? I can never remember.
So it's Ink and Paper blog, just because it started as a blog that became a YouTube channel.
Okay. Yes, and Russell and I are going to be talking about historical fiction and recommending to you some of our favorite historical fiction novels. So yeah, before we get into like the kind of recommendations, I thought it would be kind of fun to talk about like why we love historical fiction, and also an interesting point you brought up to me over text message, which is what now qualifies as historical fiction. Because I think as my sense of time is slipping, I sometimes think events were more recent than they actually were. So why do you like historical fiction, Russell?
So I think for me, historical fiction does two things. One, it usually teaches me something. So I get to learn something about a little bit of time and place, a people, an event in history, which I think is really important. And then also it usually has like a lot of heart to it. So I can really get myself invested in the people. I'm all about books teaching me things. That's sort of my mantra when I read. So I really, really love that historical fiction can do that.
Yeah, I agree, especially because I think that historical fiction can kind of elevate certain like unknown histories that maybe you wouldn't have heard about otherwise in a format that's accessible. The other reason I think I really like historical fiction is that I oftentimes find that historical fiction offers a really atmospheric quality, and there's setting for me is like really important in a book. I want to feel like the world that these characters live in feels vivid and lived in, and there's oftentimes a lot more opportunities to do that in historical fiction. Historical fiction kind of has almost like speculative fiction opportunities for like quote unquote world building, but the world building just has to be historically accurate to the time period being presented. So yeah, I really like historical fiction for a lot of the same reasons.
Yeah, I think for me, there's when historical fiction can go poorly if a author is all research and
Yes.
no what's the word I'm looking for? Like no nuance, not able to really turn it into fiction where they can just spit
Mm-hmm.
facts at me. And I've read books where I'm just like, okay, I could have read a history book. So I want, the author to have that poetic license to use those facts and make it beautiful.
I think sometimes, and I'm not a writer, so I can't speak to how true this is, but I think sometimes people who write historical fiction, they spend so much time like researching all these like tiny little details and different like rabbit holes, because a question might come up about like how somebody in such and such century would handle such and such problem. And then, they do all this research. And I think sometimes they feel like they have to put that research in or else it was like time wasted or something. So I definitely know the feeling of reading a book and being like, oh my God, like I get it. You did the research, but this is not elevating the story.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I definitely feel that as well. But yeah, I love historical fiction. And actually this year, one of my goals is to try and read a lot more historical fiction. So I'm hoping to get to a lot more. But we've both got a fair amount of recommendations to get to. So I think it might be best to start talking about some of these books. So
Absolutely.
do you want to start us off, Russell?
Yeah, so one of my favorites of historical fiction is when an author takes the life of another author and turns it into fiction about the creation of a piece of art that we're aware of. So my first recommendation is Hester by Laurie, Lico, Albanese. And it came out last year, and it's a reimagination of a woman coming over from Scotland and meeting Nathaniel Hawthorne before he wrote A Scarlet Letter.
Ooh.
And it's about her life. She gets to America, her husband winds up leaving her, she becomes a single woman, and all of sort of these things happen to her that you later see echoes of in A Scarlet Letter. So the author, one, is creating sort of like this world that we know in that Nathaniel Hawthorne lived in, this little tiny town, all of the stuff that's going on with slavery and independence and all that kind of stuff as America becomes America. And then also like imagining what Nathaniel Hawthorne was really like and how he sort of takes from the world to create his art.
Ooh, that sounds really good. I visited the Berkshire Mountains in 2019, which has Mount Greylock in it, and it's also where the author of Moby Dick, Herman Melville, lived. And I didn't realize this, but I guess but I didn't realize this until I went to Herman Melville's house with my grandmother. But Nathaniel Hawthorne and Herman Melville were actually quite close friends, and they had like this whole writer society in the Berkshire Mountains, and they would like climb the peak to the top of Mount Greylock every year and do like these readings and this whole like literary society, and like going to that house and like feeling and climbing to the top of Mount Greylock and stuff like that. It really felt like walking amongst the ghost of these literary figures. That sounds really good because it got me interested in the lives of both Herman Melville and Nathaniel Hawthorne.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, fun. So my first one is a book called The Incarnations by Susan Barker, which came out, I think, in 2014 or so. And I feel like this book has just been it made a really big splash in 2014, but I feel like it has not gotten the love over the years that I feel like it deserves, because I think it's fantastic. And it is a book that is following a taxi driver in Beijing, China, in the present day, who receives a mysterious note in the back seat of his taxi, basically from a woman who claims that she is his soulmate and that they have lived all these hundreds of lives together over the centuries and millennia in China, and that she can prove this to him by telling him these stories of their previous lives together. And all these notes keep getting dropped off in his taxi, and he's never able to catch who this woman is that's leaving these notes. And as you read the book, each note is a history of their lives together through these different dynasties. It has elements of folklore, but it's much more historical fiction. And I think what that book captures so well is that a lot of times there are a lot of historical fiction books that do this, where they take a storyline in the present day and then like a storyline in the past and kind of meld the two things together. Oftentimes those books, I feel much more invested in the storyline in the past and not as invested in the storyline in the present. Because it has this kind of speculative twist on it, it makes the storyline in the present feel so much more connected to the storyline in the past. And it has this element of almost like a thriller as you're trying to figure out who this woman is. As the story goes on, her presence as a watchful force in this man's life feels more and more oppressive, and like it's coming closer and closer in ways that are more intrusive, while at the same time presenting this like really lush, interesting historical detail, and giving you this really sweeping look at China over the centuries and these two soulmates. And in that way, it feels incredibly romantic and grand. It's a really fantastic book, and I have always struggled over the years with getting into David Mitchell novels. He's an author that I find the way his books get talked about so intriguing, but then I try to read them myself, and his prose, it's hard to get into. He is a really deep writer. And I feel like this was presenting that same type of David Mitchell-esque storytelling structure in a way that felt way more accessible for a dum-dum like me to get into the story. Have you read this one?
So I haven't read it, but it is on my shelf. So I bought it in 2014, and it is still sitting there. I think it sounds fantastic. I will say I'm a huge David Mitchell fan, and he almost wound up in this stack, to be honest. But I thought David Mitchell gets enough press. He doesn't need me talking about him to get people to read him. But that is right up my alley. I need to read it. It sounds fantastic.
I think you would really, really like it. It's one of those books that I can't remember all the details of the particular storylines in the past incredibly well, but I remember the feeling I had in that book and how uncomfortable I was feeling sometimes by this woman and who was she, and that has always stayed with me. It's a really incredible book.
Yeah, sounds great.
Mm-hmm.
My turn next?
Yeah, I believe so.
So I'm going to go from 1800s America to 1750s 1800s Iceland.
Ooh.
So, burial rites, a word that I always struggle. Burial rites by Hannah Kent is the story of a woman who is charged with the murder of two men. Her name is Agnes, and she is exiled till her death to this far, far, far part of Iceland where no one hardly ever lives. And she's put on this farm, and she's like moved into this house with these people who know exactly that she's there because they think she murdered these two men, and she's sort of just left there until they are going to actually punish her, make the decision on what her punishment will be. And what the book does is, one is it creates like this Icelandic picture of rural, hard, hard life, farm life, and the town just is so against her. But then you get these flashbacks to what brought her to the moment where she has been charged with murder, and you get to figure out that story as you go forward as well. And it is a page turner. Like, you will not stop reading it. If you liked Alias Grace by Margaret Atwood.
I was literally about to say the exact same thing. It is so much like Alias Grace. If you like those, yes.
I loved it. I thought it was absolutely fantastic. And I feel like it was there. I mean, when did this book come out? I can't even remember. I mean, I remember that everyone, oh gosh, I have a signed copy and I didn't even know that.
Oh, look at you.
You know how it is.
Mm-hmm.
This book came out in 2013, and I feel like we were all talking about it. And then, she's had a couple books come out after that I just haven't loved as much.
Mm-hmm.
But I really, really think that book holds the test of time. And if you like historical fiction, I bet you haven't read a lot of Icelandic historical fiction. I think it's brilliant, so I highly recommend it.
That book is so good at the relationship she develops with this family that she's forced to live with, because that is such an uncomfortable situation that every single person, like, she feels uncomfortable. They don't want her there, and yet they have to like grow to this, like, at a certain point they have to like kind of live with and trust each other, and that, for me, that's where that book really kind of took on a life of its own, away from Alias Grace, because I did remember thinking when I was reading it that it was so similar to Alias Grace in its premise and kind of structure, but it has a much more kind of tender, compassionate quality to it than I would say Alias Grace does, which I really love Alias Grace, don't get me wrong, but that book is I consider it a very dark, almost sinister kind of storytelling.
I found Agnes I had more compassion for Agnes than Alias.
Yes.
And I think I think both of the books are brilliant. I think they are both, and if you read them in tandem, I think they're quite interesting to see two brains sort of tackle similar ideas. But yeah, Burial Rites, Hannah Kent, highly recommend.
Yeah. And you're right, she has brought out a few. I've heard really good things about her latest book, which has come out, which I don't know if we have a US release for it.
Not yet, I don't think so.
No, which is a real shame, because I think that one sounds really good. I might end up like breaking my book buying goals and purchasing that one on Book Depository, which is something I'm trying not to do. My next one is one that got a lot of buzz a few years ago when it was, I believe, longlisted or shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize, and that is Washington Black by S.E. Edugyan.
I love that all of your historical fiction so far has had a touch of the fantasy that is Chris to me.
Yes, so far, yes. There is a certain... That one, like, that what I love about this book is that there's moments when I had to, like, think to myself, was that a real technology? That couldn't have been real, like, because it made you fully believe in it. So this is a book which follows the life of a young man who is named Washington Black, and he starts off his life as an enslaved young boy on a sugar plantation in Barbados. And his master is an exceptionally cruel man who finds pleasure in subtle not only like the harsh cruelties to his slaves, but also like the subtle poking fun at, which is why he's named all of his slaves after presidents, which is why the young man is named Washington Black. And Washington soon starts to develop a close kinship with the slave master's brother, who I believe his name is Christopher. I can't remember. And they develop a relationship, a friendship. And Christopher is kind of like this new agey kind of scientist. He's really interested in enlightenment and all this different stuff and new technologies. And he takes on young Washington to be kind of this apprentice artist, working on his scientific experiments together. And the book really takes off when these two ultimately make an escape from the plantation. And you watch as Washington has to kind of live out the rest of his life as a freed black man in the world. And he goes to all sorts of different places. He ends up, I believe, in England, Canada. And in each of those places, he's kind of forced to confront how free he truly is. And he's this incredibly smart man. He's incredibly intelligent, incredibly educated. And yet, he finds himself kind of constantly denied access to spaces that his contemporaries would not be denied access to. And you have to navigate all these different things. But there's this incredible, like, it has the feeling when you're reading it of almost like a Jules Verne or something, like this incredible, like, exciting adventure, and, you know, this almost fantastical edge to all the different science that's taking place. And it's just brilliant. And it's beautifully written. Essie Edugyan, I've not read any of her other books, and I've been meaning to get to her other books ever since I read this, because I was just blown away by how beautiful the writing was, how tender these character relationships were, and just how much you fall in love with Washington Black as a character. I just loved it.
So this is going to be me saying things that I think are true. Like, I'm 99% sure. But so I believe she only has 2 books. I believe both were shortlisted for the Booker. Her debut was like Half-Blood Blues, I think is what it's called, which I think, in my opinion, I think it's a stronger book. So I think you'll like it. I believe Washington Black won the Giller Prize, which is like Canadian version of the National Book Awards. So yeah, 100% support the. I cannot say her name without saying it terribly, but she is like one of those authors. I think that everything she writes you should read, past, future, and forward. So
yeah, I'm really looking forward to for Half-Blood Blues. That's what it's called.
I think it's called Half-Blood Blues. I'm pulling that out of my head.
It sounds right. I remember hearing that name.
And I think that's set in Germany, if I'm not mistaken. Been a really long time since I've read it. So
is that one also historical fiction?
Yes.
Okay.
So this is where I'm going to test the idea of historical fiction a little bit, because you and I were talking. You were like, "Oh, 1950s or before." But my next 2 books are much closer to now. Even though I'm about to talk about the 1970s, which is 50 years ago. So
okay,
put it in to perspective. But the next book I want to talk about is Take My Hand by Dolen Perkins-Valdez. This is set in 1973 Montgomery, Alabama. This is actually based on a true and yet horrifying story, but at the main center of this is a young Black woman who graduates from college to become a nurse, and she becomes a nurse at a family health clinic in Alabama. And her charge is to go around and out to the country and provide birth control to young Black women. And one of the families she winds up at are these 2 girls, and one is like 13 and one is like 11. And she's like, why am I giving birth control to these 2 young girls? They live in the middle of nowhere. They're clearly not sexually active. They live with just their dad and their grandma. And so it becomes this investigation, and she finds out that there's this sort of mandate to stop poor people of color, Black and Hispanic, from having children and procreating. And she makes the decision to stop giving these shots to these young girls. And but what winds up happening is, like, her boss at the clinic goes out to the home and convinces the mother and father to sign paperwork. They're illiterate, they cannot read, and they give girls hysterectomies, and they're not even 16 years old. And what happens is she becomes an advocate for these 2 young girls. She winds up getting them moved out of the country and into housing in the city, gets the dad a job, and they pursue the state. And it turns out that this is actually like a national mandate. This has been happening across America. This is a true story. And this case went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the president at the time got involved and interviewed these young girls. And they were, they were literally, their ability to have children was taken away from them because white people had decided that these groups of people should not have children because they were making that decision. It is horrifying, but at the center of this is the story of these two young girls and their relationship with this nurse, and how that relationship changed this nurse's entire point of view on what she was going to do. She makes decisions on what she's going to do in her medical career. She just becomes an advocate. And once they start investigating, it's happening in not only Alabama, but like all the way to California. This is happening, and they get stories, and it's just horrifying. But it's also like, I don't want to say it's hopeful because terrible, terrible things happen, but it's about like perseverance and getting through it and how you do all that kind of stuff. It is a fabulous book. It is a heart wrencher. It is not for those who can't take it. You will cry, but it is really, this was one of those things where I said in the beginning, I started to investigate. And it's based on a true story. It's based on the life of these two young girls. And it was fantastic. So take my hand, Dolen Perkins-Valdez, highly recommend it.
That sounds really good. Is this a debut? I've never heard of her before.
No, so Dolen Perkins-Valdez wrote a book called Wench that is like sort of like a modern American classic. And this is her follow-up. And it's been decades, I think, since she put out Wench.
Yes. Okay. Interesting. Wow, that sounds really freaking good, and I had not heard of it yet. Is that a new release?
No, actually, I think it came out last year by Berkeley Books. So newish.
That just did not come on my radar, and it sounds really freaking good. I'm mad that I've not heard of it before. Okay. The next one is one that I talked about in detail on the last episode, but I'm going to repeat it again because I think it's so fantastic, and not everybody listens to every episode, so I'm going to talk about it again. And that's a book called The North Water by Ian Maguire, which was also, I believe, longlisted for the Booker when it came out. It might have been 2015 or 2016. And it follows this man who is named Joseph Sumner, and he is a surgeon with kind of a murky past who is going on to a whaling expedition to the north at a time when the whaling industry is kind of failing because they've overkilled the whales. They've decreased the whale population so much. And this expedition is heading north, and he is going to go onto this expedition. And he tells the people that are running this expedition that he's actually set to inherit some land from Ireland. But this land deal is being held up in legislation. As a reader that that's probably not true. But you don't know exactly what his past is, and you find that out as you read the book. And he goes onto this ship. What he doesn't realize is that there's a man on the ship, whose name I've forgotten, who is just pure evil. The book actually opens up with this man raping and murdering a young boy in the streets. And as the story goes on, one of the cabin boys ends up dead on the ship, and Joseph Sumner is investigating who is responsible. So it has this, kind of mystery element to a certain extent because, he's off to find the killer. But as the reader, you know exactly who the killer is. But the book is so dark and so claustrophobic and so thrilling with this language that captures this setting in a way that just crackles. Like, you are reading it and it is impossible to put down. And it's a book that really looks at what is evil, how do we face evil, what compromises do people make with evil, what happens when people compromise with evil, and all of these men, all on this ship, all with these very murky pasts and sordid ambitions, all set against this incredibly apathetic, harsh environment of the cold Arctic North. And it is just a ride. It is a pure adrenaline rush from start to finish.
I had never heard of it, and then you texted me, "Have I ever read this book?" And I was like,
Yeah.
"Well, clearly, I need to read this book." I don't get these texts from Chris very often.
I guess I thought that you had, because I remember thinking that I had heard about it from you for some reason, but then I couldn't find it on your Goodreads. That's why I was like, I thought I had heard about it from you.
Uh,
It's a ride.
well, it sounds like it fits right into your sweet spot when it comes to atmosphere and setting and all of that being so
Mm-hmm.
there.
It's very dark. Like, I will say, like, there were points where it was almost too much for me, and I can stomach a lot in a book, you know? So, like, I would definitely say if you're sensitive to, I mean, obviously it opens up with a sexual assault. So if you're sensitive to these types of issues, it really goes there, and it's very difficult to take. But that is the point of the book as well. So I would just say be cautious of that going into it. This is where we take a little break to tell you about all the different ways you can support the podcast, some of which are totally free. A really effective and easy way of showing your support is by rating and reviewing us on iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcasts. There is a link in the show notes that will take you straight to the Apple Podcast page where you can write a review. And if you listen on Spotify, you can now very easily give us a star rating. You can also share our posts on social media. We are at Bookcast Club on both Instagram and Twitter. You can sign up to our free monthly newsletter, where we share even more book recommendations and all the latest podcast news. But the best way for us to find new listeners is by you telling your book-loving friends and family about us. If you want to support the podcast financially, we do have a Patreon account. You can sign up for as little as £2 a month. We offer early access to the podcast, monthly bonus episodes, and our top tier will get you all of the above and personalized book recommendations. We get you to fill in a survey, and then we tailor our book recommendations to your preferences. We will also send you books in the post. There are over 15 bonus episodes you can get instant access to if you sign up as a patron today. The link is in our show notes. But however you choose to show your support, we as always want to say a huge thank you. We appreciate each and every one of our listeners.
So my next book, again, pushes that idea of historical fiction because it's actually set in 1986. So
1986?
Yep. So
okay.
That is still before you were born?
It is, yeah. Is the new historical fiction like Stranger Things than before?
But the reason I say that this is historical fiction is for twofold. So this is The Prettiest Star by Carter Sickels. Carter Sickels is a trans author. He is a professor, I think, in Kentucky at a university. This story takes on the AIDS epidemic in America from a different point of view. So our main character is a young boy from the Midwest who moves to New York because he knows that he cannot be out gay I think he's in a tiny Ohio town. He goes there, he finds his people, and then the AIDS epidemic hits. His partner at the time winds up passing away. Everyone he knows passes away, and he gets sick, and he has no options but to return home to this teeny tiny town to his family in Ohio, who really have no idea who he has become. And the book becomes this treatise on the idea of what gay men had to deal with in the 80s as they were dying and when they were searching for anyone to show them any sort of compassion. His dad will not even sort of still recognize the fact that he's gay, and they don't want to deal with it. His mom is trying to get her hands around it, and he has a younger sister who is also trying to become herself as well. And as the book goes on, he just wants to he knows, and he's not going to make it much longer. And he just wants to live out the rest of his life. And the town comes after him. It was based, sort of inspired by a story that Carter saw on Oprah about a man who had AIDS who tried to go to a public swimming pool and how it caused like this entire small town to shut down. Our main character does that in this book, and it's all about him trying to find peace before he passes. But really what it is it's the story of a mother and a son coming to terms with each other and getting a chance to reconcile their love before they have to say goodbye. It is heart-wrenching. I bawled my eyes out at the end of this book. But I'm always a sucker for mom and son stories, or like dad and son stories, where they come to realize how important they are to each other. I always That really hits me in the heart. But it also is, we hear a lot about the AIDS epidemic in New York. Like, we've gotten that point of view in that picture a lot. This one sort of takes it to what happened in these small towns where, gay men and women were still living, but gay men were dying and they didn't have anyone to support them, and what were they going to do about it. So I think it is one of the most beautifully written books that I've ever read. The compassion, the storytelling, and yeah, it's just so good and so sad, but also like really hopeful at the end, if that makes sense.
I really want to read this. I have to really pace myself with AIDS books. I find it's one of the few topics I find in books where I find myself like really spiraling when I read about it. Like, it's a very difficult topic to confront, but that one sounds really good. Because I think, like you said, you hear about it all the time from the coasts and stuff, but what was happening in these small towns was horrific. And I grew up where Ryan White was from, and it's that story has always been in the consciousness there. But I know people who would admit to the fact that like they bullied Ryan White in high school or in middle school or whatever, and would just like talk about it in a way that was very like flippant. And like that type of thing just was very horrific. I think that as bad as the epidemic was in those cities, there was at least this idea that there was like community to be had, because there were so many people, you were bound to find other gay people, which is not the case in the smaller towns. But yeah, I do want to read that, but I'm going to have to pace myself. I'm still recovering from reading like Tell the Wolves I'm Home, and that was like years ago.
But I mean, it still meets the definition of historical fiction, right?
No,
I'm
yeah,
good enough in there. Like,
no, yeah, and that's interesting to talk about, because I think especially when it's something like that that's like covering something that was specific to the time period, that might fall more to. I mean, the idea of historical fiction, it's vague. It's kind of what we want it to be.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah. The next one I have is a book called How We Disappeared by Jing-Jing Lee, which tackles the subject of comfort women, Japanese comfort women in World War II. And it does this through a really interesting dual narrative, which is a very common thing, as I've talked about in historical fiction. But the first narrative is set in the 1940s, and it's following the perspective of a young woman in a village, I believe in Singapore. I can't remember. I'm pretty sure it's Singapore, in the 1940s, early 1940s, who is kidnapped by Japanese forces and sold into sexual slavery as a comfort woman. And you follow her perspective through that incredibly traumatic period. But then you also get the perspective in the year 2000 of a young man, a young boy, I should say, whose grandmother is in the hospital, and she makes a strange confession to him when she doesn't realize who he is. Like, she thinks he's somebody else, and she makes this very strange confession that forces him to kind of confront his grandmother's past and find out more about her life. And the book, really, present-day storyline with the young boy is very good. You really get in his head about kind of the fear of when you uncover like your family's past and those dark, complicated things. But the book really sings following Wang Di's perspective in World War II as she's going through these Japanese camps as a sexual slave. And the book also really tackles the shame, the stigma that was attached to these women after the war ended. Not only because they were abused sexually, but also because in some cases they were viewed as having supported the enemy, and what that meant for them in terms of later on in history, because I never really knew much about Japanese comfort women. It was something I had heard of but never really looked into. But the Japanese government has done everything in their power to shut this story up, to to not allow it to be told. And that shame and stigma that so many of these women had allowed for that to happen because it was so difficult to get women who were willing to speak up about their experiences in these camps. The way this book handled that was just really haunting and really a gut punch. It's a really good book, and I feel like it has not gotten as much buzz as I would like to have seen.
Yeah, I've never heard of it.
Yeah, it got longlisted for the Women's Prize when it came out, but that was it. It didn't make much more of a splash, and I'm glad it did get longlisted because that's how I heard about it and why I picked it up, and I think it's really fantastic.
Wow, sounds great. A lot of the stories we're talking about today, Chris, are rather sad in nature.
I know.
Is there happy historical fiction, or are we just not drawn to happy historical fiction?
I'm not drawn to happy books in general.
Yeah, me either. Every once in a while, I'd like something to be a little funny, but usually not happy. So, well, I'm going to transition into books that are coming out this year. So everything I've talked about so far has come out. So, but these are books that are either just out now or coming out a little further in the year. The first one I want to talk about is In Memoriam by Alice Winn. This is coming out from Knopf in March of this year. I just finished this book and whew. So I have this thing about how I felt like for a long time historical fiction only came about World War II. So I stopped like trying to read historical fiction because I felt that was every book. But I was like, there's so much more to it. This one is set in World War I, and I thought it was so different and unique. It took a really unique perspective. So it starts at the start of World War I. We're in a boys' school in England. And it starts as sort of like this queer romance. We have these two boys, they're in this boarding school, they like each other, but they won't tell each other. And you find out that there's a lot of sort of like this queerness in this school. But one of the boys is of German descent. And when the war starts, his family starts to get a lot of pressure. So they sort of almost force him to enlist in the British Army early so that the family can say that they're not German sympathizers. And he goes to war and he communicates with this boy, this man that he's in love with, but they won't tell each other. And war starts to change him. He's in the trenches. He's in Belgium, I believe, and he goes and in a fight, gets injured. He watches people die, and he's writing, and he just basically tells his name is Elwood, don't ever come to war. Don't ever come. Do everything you can to stay away. Well, Elwood's like, now I have to go, and he enrolls early and shows up at the front. And the whole book is about how war affects this relationship, not only between these two boys who turn into men. I think at the end of the book, they're like 19, but everything they've gone through has just made them so world weary. But all of their classmates are just, Britain, so much death in World War I. All of these boys were dying. And you learn about how people knew about these relationships. And if you were sort of found out, you would have been in a lot of trouble. You would have been court-martialed, but they sort of persevere. The war separates them for a while. They both deal with injuries and all that kind of stuff. And what happens afterwards? And it's sort of like this weird World War I queer romance set against the backdrop of the horrific nature that war has on destroying lives and people. But in the end, you're sort of, it's hopeful, but it definitely will take you through the ringer. So In Memoriam, Alice Winn, out in March from Knopf. I loved it so very, very much. And I think it's a debut novel.
Wow. Yeah, I just listened to your latest BookTube video talking about that, and I was like, oh, God, that sounds really good. That sounds devastating, though, but really, really good.
It's really good, yeah.
And it says coming out in March?
Yeah, March of 2023. The book doesn't have an exact date on it. It just says March.
March. Oh, I'm going to be watching out for that one. The next one I'm going to talk about is one I'm actually not finished reading yet. I'm like 3/4 of the way through it, but I'm convinced this is going to be like a new all-time favorite book for me. Like the whole time I'm reading it, I'm actively thinking to myself, I cannot wait to reread this book, which is a very rare thing for me to be like thinking while I'm reading. And that is Hild by Nicola Griffith. So this is set in the 7th century, I believe, and it's following the perspective of the woman who would grow up to be Saint Hilda of Whitby, which I did not grow up Catholic, so I know very little about saints, but there's also very little known about Saint Hilda of Whitby, which kind of has allowed Nicola Griffith to kind of take a lot of creative license with her life story. And this book is extraordinarily detailed. There is a lot of historical detail in it. It can at times feel overwhelming, but incredibly rewarding as well, which is a very good feeling to have. I like when I'm reading a book that feels challenging, but doesn't feel like in a frustrating way. Like it's like I'm excited to try and figure out these different storylines and stuff. So Hild, when the book opens up, is a very young woman. She's only, I believe, like 5 or 6 at the very beginning. And her father is assassinated by poison. He would have been king of Northumbria, but his brother, Edwin, takes over. And now Hild and her sister Herswith and her mother have to basically figure out what they're going to do in Edwin's court and how they're going to survive without the political capital of the father who would have been king. And Hild does this by basically convincing people that she's a seer, when in fact she is just a very perceptive young woman who's able to parse out political situations and give really good advice. And so it kind of has that Joan of Arc feeling because she's kind of convincing people of this. And it is a book where you just watch her grow up. Like it's a Romensbildung. As you're watching her grow up with the weight of this idea that she's this seer, constantly trying to figure out how to navigate these different political situations and present them to the king in a way that feels ethereal and dreamlike and that gains his trust so that she survives. Because if she's no longer useful, she will be killed, you know. She will not be able to survive these political situations. And it is gorgeously detailed. Like the way it brings to life the atmosphere, the communities that these people are building, just the day-to-day chores. It's in the little details that you just find like such beauty and joy. Like at one point she describes the color of leaves as being pale, like newborn kittens' eyes. And it's just like so beautiful. Like there's all these different things that you're reading and you just find such joy at just the small little turns of phrase. And it's been a while, I think, since I've read a book that has just put such a smile on my face from the writing alone, just from the sentence by sentence writing alone. And that's what this has done. And I just find it wonderful. And I think that there's a real tendency to think of the Dark Ages as dismal, damp, depressing. And I don't think you can read this book and have that thought about the Dark Ages any longer.
Is this your first Nicola Griffith?
Yes,
okay.
It is. I know she's written like So Lucky, Spear, a few others. Yeah.
So Nicola Griffith is also, I think she had, I think in the 90s, don't quote me on that, but she was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. And so she's a huge advocate for, the fight against ableism. And she writes what she calls cryptlit. And So Lucky is a phenomenal book about a woman who deals with a health condition and about the strength of getting through it. Spear is a retelling of the Arthurian legend through the point of view of a queer lady of the lake. So if that's up your, that's up Chris's alley. Let's be honest. Yeah. But yeah, no, she's a phenomenal writer and she's a phenomenal person. So I'm really glad that you're reading it and loving it so much. So.
Oh, it's really good. Like I said, it's complicated. Like there's definitely been moments where I'm like, I can't process all this information. And I don't think you're meant to be able to process all the information. Like I think it is at times meant to kind of overwhelm you, but I'm looking forward to like rereading it kind of armed with the knowledge that I have from the first read to like make sense of certain things. But yeah, it's really a really fantastic book.
Awesome. Independence by Chitra Banerjee Divakaruni. My pronunciation of that name was terrible, so I apologize 100% to Chitra. This is a story set in 1947's India. during the partition of British India, and it's the story of three sisters who live in a village in Bengal. They're daughters of a doctor. He's very well off, and during sort of this revolutionary time, he winds up getting killed. And then the three daughters have to figure out what they're going to do with themselves and how they're going to live life and how they're going to move forward as the partition of India from Britain is going on and all of these changes. And, they were sort of protected by their father, and now he's no longer there. And it's just really the story of the women going through this and having to survive themselves in this country where they don't have the power to always do what they want to do, and the very three different ways that they tackle.
That sounds really good.
So it has the most beautiful cover, Chris. Look how beautiful that cover is.
Oh my gosh.
It's so beautiful.
Ooh.
So, and I really apologize to Chitra for butchering her name, but Independence, Chitra, Banerjee, Divakaruni.
And that's coming out later this year?
It just came out. I think you.
Oh, it just came out.
Yeah, it just came out. So I usually get them about a couple weeks when they're in hardback before they come out, and so it just arrived on shelves.
Ooh, that sounds really good. I think for my next one, I'm gonna do an author that everyone knows, but I think this is one of her less hyped books, and I think it's really good, and that's Affinity by Sarah Waters. So Sarah Waters is very well known for the novels. I feel like her two most famous were probably Fingersmith and The Little Stranger.
Oh, I would have said Tipping the Velvet.
Tipping the Velvet, I would say too. Yeah, those three. Then I feel like her other three books kind of get not as talked about as much, but I loved Affinity. I feel like if you have not read Fingersmith, read Affinity first. Because I think if you read Fingersmith and then you read Affinity, it's very difficult to not compare those two novels because they have a similar premise, but Fingersmith is much better. So, if you can read Affinity first is what I'm saying. This is following a woman who, her father has recently passed, and so it's just her and her mother. She's kind of upper class. I don't know if she's super noble, but she's definitely rich. Her father really protected her from having to kind of do the things that would have been expected of her class. She's not somebody who's really into being a noble woman. But now her father is no longer there, and she has to do something to be seen as being a gentlewoman. And so what she decides to do is to start volunteering at a local women's prison, where what her role will be at this women's prison is to just go there, talk to the women, and be an example to them of good moral behavior. And while she's there, she starts to become close to this woman who is in prison because she is accused of killing a man during a seance. And she claims complete innocence. That she didn't actually kill this man, but in fact, she actually can commune with the dead, and it was one of the ghosts that killed him. And she starts to convince our protagonist of her innocence and try and recruit her to help her get out of the prison. And she does things that prove that she really does have supernatural abilities. And that's all I'll say, because I don't want to spoil anything. But it's very twisty. It's like Sarah Waters' books. It has this very wonderful, intimate lesbian thing going on. And it's just a book that really sends you down a rabbit hole and feels very spooky and scary and gothic and gives you all the feels. And it has a really great gut punch of an ending, which I think Sarah Waters is pretty well known for having really good endings.
Wow. She hasn't had a book come out in some time.
I know. I'm about to write her a letter of complaint.
Well, at least she's not on the Donna Tartt path, but
no.
Okay, so I think the last one I'm going to end with is called The House of Eve by Sadiqa Johnson. This comes out this month from Simon & Schuster. Again, this is one that's set. This one's set in the 1950s, And I am a sucker. You talked about it before. I love the dueling narratives where you have two different characters going through things and then they wind up clashing. So the first character is a 15-year-old young Black woman who is going to be the first in her family to attend college. And this is in spite of her whole family life. Her mother doesn't really want to raise her. They're very poor. And she's going to finally break this mold and go to university. However, she sort of gets involved with someone, has this love affair that's not approved of, and it may bring everything crashing down. All I'm going to say on that. Then the other person is a woman who comes to Washington, D.C. She's really ambitious. She wants to be involved in everything that is DC. She meets a man who at university at Howard. They fall in love, but he is from like this very Black wealthy family, and they don't really approve of her, and they won't really like let her into the family. So she winds up getting pregnant in hopes that the baby will fix that problem for her, that they will finally let her be part of the family. But of course, that's going to come with its own problems. And then these two stories of these two Black women, sort of navigating societal issues come together. In Washington, D.C., in 1950s Philadelphia, they wind up intermingling. So I love that kind of stuff. I love sort of a story that is about these women overcoming their obstacles. So that's The House of Eve. Actually, this comes out this week on February 7th. As we record this, I don't know if this podcast will probably not come out immediately, but it will be out, I think, by the time you hear this. The House of Eve by Sadiqa Johnson, out from Simon & Schuster.
Wow, that sounds really good. Always count on you to tell us the good new releases coming out. I don't know how you are so good at staying current with all the new releases. It's a gift.
It is hard, but I'm really, really blessed, I have to say, that publishers send me new releases, things that they think I will like. So that always really helps. But that's from years of doing this, so I really appreciate it.
Yeah, but I mean, a lot of people get sent books by publishers. You're actually really good about keeping really on top of it. You know what I'm saying? Like, you are, like, every time I watch you, I'm like, I don't know how you keep up with all this stuff coming out. But no. Well, awesome. I'm really glad that you were able to come on here and share with us all these wonderful historical fiction recommendations.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm so excited.
Yeah, this was a lot of fun. Where can the good people find you on the social medias?
So I am Ink and Paper Blog on, all social media. If you Google Ink and Paper Blog, my YouTube channel will 100% come up. Usually with my face, which is a little disconcerting. I'm Ink and Paper Blog on Instagram, and I don't use Twitter a ton, but I am there as well. And that's where you can find me.
And his Instagram's really worth following. You take really nice pictures of books.
Thank you.
Very aesthetic.
It's hard. It takes a long time. It's not my forte, to be honest with you, but I feel blessed to be sent books, and I want to make them look as pretty as possible to get people to pick them up. So,
well, awesome. Thank you very much for listening to the Bookcast Club. If you would like to contact us with questions, ideas, feedbacks, or recommendations, feel free to email us at thebookcastclub@outlook.com. You can also contact us on Twitter and Instagram, where we are at Bookcast Club. In addition, you can also sign up to our newsletter, where we will have more reviews, new releases, podcast recommendations, and updates on the pod. And of course, we're also on Patreon, where you can access early episodes and other goodies for as little as £2 a month. But thank you very much for listening, and we can't wait to talk to you guys soon.